This conference will now be recorded.
Okay, so welcome everyone. My name is Melissa Petrangelo Scaia. I am the Director of International Training at Global Rights for Women. I'll do a little bit further introduction of myself in just a moment. But as I had stated before, as you're logging in, if you could tell us where you're joining from, that would be great. And then, as I had said before, if you don't mute your mic or accidentally turn on your webcam, we will be shutting that off. So just know if your mic ends up being muted, that's because Laura or I have done that for you. We also just want to welcome everyone from around the world. We're just thrilled that you're all here. As I had mentioned before, we have a lot of people that had signed up for this, so we're very excited about that. I've gotten to know Chris and Rebecca over the last couple years, I guess, you know, in a more professional and a colleague and friend way, so I'm just thrilled. Sorry for the short sort of sign up for this. To get our schedules and Chris and Rebecca's schedules to work, this is what worked. So we went with it, and we were thrilled that so many people signed up in such a short period of time. So welcome to everyone as we're here. So I am going to turn it over to Laura for some further introduction and some logistics.
Thank you, Melissa. I'm Laura Wilson. I'm an attorney with Global Rights for Women, and this webinar this morning is on conducting risk assessment on domestic violence with considerations for Batterers Intervention Programs during COVID-19. I'm just going to start by going through some webinar logistics for today. As Melissa's mentioned, please keep your microphones muted, and also you can mute your cell phones if you're calling in by cell phone. Please type any questions that you have into the chat box during the presentation, and I'll be keeping an eye on the chat box. I'll try to pose questions that are relevant to what the presenters are talking about, you know, during their presentation, so that it can be more of a conversation. But I also will probably save some questions for the end of the presentation. And as Melissa mentioned, we will be recording this presentation, and we'll be sending you a link to this presentation, and also posting it on our website for anyone who may have missed the live presentation today, if you want to let your colleagues know. Global Rights for Women, many of you probably know us and some of you don't. We're a nonprofit based in Minneapolis, Minnesota, and we work with leaders around the world to advance women and girls' human right to live free from violence through legal reform and institutional and social change. And we see many of our partners from around the world joining us today. We're so excited to see you, and happy to share this information together. So I am going to turn it over to the other panelists to introduce yourselves and begin the presentation.
Great. So I will start. As I said before, I'm Melissa Petrangelo Scaia, the Director of International Training at Global Rights for Women. I'll also be talking about my work doing Batterers Intervention groups, and Chris and I will be talking about that sort of service in particular, and doing that through video conference technology. So we'll be sharing some of that as well. So when you see that there, that's also related to that. I had come to you excited just to be with all of you here today, and to share some information as the former director of the Duluth model and some of the work that we had done there as it relates to risk assessment. Chris, do you want to go next? Chris?
Okay, sorry. So I'm Chris Huffine. I'm a psychologist and executive director of Allies in Change in Portland, Oregon. I've been working with abusive partners, primarily male identified, for the past 28 years, and also do trainings on working with abusive partners, running groups, as well as things like risk assessment. And I'm happy to be here today.
Great, thank you. Rebecca, before we go to you next, we have a couple of people with their webcams on. We'll shut those off for you if you don't shut those off, but we just want to remind people to shut off your webcam and turn on your mic, please. But Rebecca, go ahead.
Hi, my name is Rebecca Thomforde Hauser. I'm the Associate Director of Gender and Family Justice Programs at the Center for Court Innovation. We work with jurisdictions around the country to enhance their criminal, civil, and community responses to domestic violence. We are funded by the Office on Violence Against Women to provide training and technical assistance to a number of their grantee funding streams, and I see some of people there, some of my grantees, which is exciting. More specifically, we are funded by the Office on Violence Against Women to provide training and technical assistance around abusive partner intervention and engagement.
Great. So we're going to start then right into the PowerPoint. I think lots more people have logged on. Just one final reminder to mute your lines and turn off your webcam if you haven't. And Rebecca, get us started, please.
Sure. So I think I'm excited to see so many people on the call. I think when we talk about risk assessment, it is an issue that we are all struggling with and thinking about all the time. And it's important to stop and think about what are we talking about when we're talking about risk in domestic violence cases, because depending on who you are and what your job is, what your role is in this coordinated community response, risk can mean something different to each of us. And so there are a few different ways to think about it. One, most of the research around risk is really looking at that risk of future violence. Some research and some folks are at risk of lethality. Others are looking at a risk of non-criminal activity that is still coercive, right? And that's really important in the context of domestic violence. And then for all of us, who have been working in that coordinated community response, we're always thinking about that risk of system intervention. So what risks do we pose as providers to the safety of that victim? And there may be other ways of looking at risk as well, but it's important to always be thinking about and understanding the context in which we are talking and thinking about risk.
So Rebecca, just one thing quick is that if you could just let Laura know when to change the slide and just say next slide, that would be great. She did it now, but just for the future slides, thank you.
Great. So again, when we're thinking about risk for what, oftentimes we're thinking about what that risk is for that domestic violence victim or survivor. We're thinking about what safety measures and safety planning we can do with the victim and their children. And then other times we're thinking about if we're working with the person who's caused harm or the defendant or respondent, we're thinking about offender management. What risk does this person pose to commit another domestic violence related crime? Or larger in the context of DV, what are the risks for future acts of domestic violence, right, that might not rise to a crime? So we're thinking about risk, and we're also thinking about safety. Next slide. So when we're thinking about offender management, there's a few different ways of thinking about risk. As I said before, most of the research is looking at the risk of reoffense. And there's a few different ways that most people are using that information to inform their decision making, right? They're looking at likelihood of any offense. They might be looking at likelihood of a violent felony offense. Again, these wouldn't be necessarily even domestic violence related. And then in the domestic violence realm, we're in addition looking at, is this defendant, respondent, person who caused harm, are they at risk for committing another domestic violence related crime? And then again, when we're thinking about victim safety, we're thinking about, is this victim at risk of being killed by her intimate partner, or are they at risk for serious, almost lethal harm? And there are many ways of classifying that risk depending on, what your purpose is and the context, but folks are often, wanting to classify it. Is this person low risk, moderate, high, somewhere in between? And we'll talk, Melissa and Chris are going to talk about, the importance of doing that, and also just some reminders around the limitations of what that means. And we'll start off by saying, obviously, when we're talking about this, we're never talking about denying someone safety services or safety planning. We're really thinking about it in the context of what are those risk or lethality factors, and how can we, as victim advocates, as abusive partner intervention programs, as probation, as courts, how can we respond to these specific factors in a meaningful way to enhance safety? Next slide. So why should we care about risk? That may seem like a silly question, but I think, it's important when we're engaging in our coordinated community response to really think about why we're doing this work around risk and risk assessment, right? So risk information can be used to really help us understand what's going on with this defendant or respondent or participant in our program. The risk needs responsivity research, which we'll talk about in a second, really talks about the importance of using that risk information to inform our decision-making process. It can also help us. It can help us in our conversations with victims and survivors, really promote those service linkages and increase that safety. It can also help us flag for lethality, right? We want to think about those multi-pronged responses, those coordinated responses, and so flag cases that might need more support and targeted support around that lethality. And then we're also thinking about officer safety or our own safety when we're working with folks who are at high risk for violence, right? We know it's dangerous, always dangerous for the victim, but it can be dangerous for law enforcement or any other type of person who's engaging with that person. Next slide.
Rebecca, could I add something here?
Sure.
So I think another important aspect of the risk, why we need to know about risk, is if we're working with the abusive partner, is really part of our work should be helping reduce their risk and addressing the areas that may be increasing their risk and being mindful of those in the work we do with them. And that's partly, what you can call it risk-informed treatment planning. And I think that's an important role the providers can play that we'll be talking about a little bit later as well. So it's not like we're helpless when we see these risk factors in somebody who's abusive. We can actually work with them directly to help lower their risk and that sort of thing.
That's so true. And I think that ties in really nicely with the risk needs responsivity model, which, again, this came from talking about general criminogenic risk and recidivism. So not domestic violence offenders in particular, but any type of criminal activity. There are over 300 studies on the importance of identifying and understanding risk, the needs, and the responsivity of the person who's committed that crime. And what's interesting about it is this is really focusing on recidivism. We know in the context of domestic violence, there's a lot more harm that can be done than committing another DV-related crime, right? Criminal activity is one part of that coercive control. But the rest of the world, when they're thinking about criminal activity, they're really thinking about what are the risks this person poses, what are their criminogenic needs, and what responsivity issues do they have in terms of responding to any court mandate, programming, that thing. And there's a lot of research that talks about the importance of these things and ways to address these needs to reduce that recidivism so that we're not just, operating without context. Next slide. So what does the risk principle tell us? Again, this is thinking really in the context of offender management. So we want to assess for risk, right? There are different types of labels, as I said before, that or categories of risk. Oftentimes when folks are low risk, what the research tells us is that there should be minimal intervention. Now, again, this is talking about general criminogenic risk. We're going to talk more about the specifics of DV risk in a minute, but we don't want to necessarily program someone who is low risk. The research has showed that can make them actually more high risk in the future. Moderate to high risk, we want to treat those criminogenic and other needs, and then we want to really know who those high risk folks are so that we can consider, if incarceration makes sense or intensive supervision and monitoring. And again, this is coming from the general criminogenic world of risk. So your general person who is getting arrested. We can go to the next slide. Right, okay, so the need principle, okay, well, that's fine. The need principle really tells us what we need to be thinking about when we're working with someone, what needs do they have that we can address through our programming and supervision. And then responsivity, as I said, is really looking for those additional needs and attributes such as trauma, and we'll talk about that more in the context of abusive partner intervention programming, and also identifying those strengths so that we can create individualized responses for folks. We can go on. Sorry, some of our slides are like, we have to scroll through them a little bit. Okay, so what do we mean by risk factors? We won't spend too much time talking about this general criminogenic risk, but we really just wanted to ground what we're going to be talking about in the sense of there is a history and a wide breadth of research on the importance of understanding risk. And what they found with a general criminal behavior are these 8, they call them the central 8 criminogenic factors, right? If these are in someone's history or going on right now for someone who's arrested, this is what our criminal system is looking at and thinking about, okay, what's going to make this person high risk for committing another general crime? When we're talking about domestic violence, as we said before, we're really looking at 2 different things. We're looking at that risk of recidivism. Is this person going to commit another domestic violence related crime? And we're looking at lethality. Is this victim, survivor, someone who is at increased risk of being killed or almost killed by their intimate partner? And so we'll talk about those factors and the research behind them moving forward. We can go to the next slide. So Chris, do you want to talk a little bit about these different categories of risk factors and what we're talking about when we're actually talking about what a risk factor might be?
Yes, I'm happy to. And I think this is also relevant, again, in the idea of actually trying to change them. So static risk factors are those that can't be changed. In other words, once you've got that risk factor, it's going to be with you for good. A good example of that is a criminal history. So once somebody has a criminal history, there's nothing you can do to change that. Dynamic risk factors, on the other hand, are those that can change over time. And those we're especially interested in because we can have an impact on those. So an example is access to a firearm or being unemployed. So, for example, if you are able to have firearms removed from the home, that will, to some extent, lower risk in that area. Stable risk factors are a subset where they're more enduring and they can change over time, but they tend to change more slowly. So you can, again, affect stable risk factors, but you're not going to be able to change them overnight. Acute risk factors are ones that are actually often not talked about in risk assessments because they're happening in the moment. And so it's, in some ways, if you just look at like the criminogenic factors and things of that nature, it's easy to overlook these, but these are of special concern because they mean right now in the moment, we're concerned. And a few examples of acute risk factors are somebody who's intoxicated right now, or someone who's at a high level of distress. So for example, if I have a man in the group, he comes in tonight and he reports, I almost didn't make it in tonight. I just got served with divorce papers. This is coming out of the blue. I can't believe she's doing this. I don't know what I'm going to do. That's an acute risk factor, and that requires potentially immediate intervention or figuring out what you're going to need to do. And then the final group are idiographic risk factors. And these are ones that are very rare. And because they're so rare, we're not going to routinely assess for them because they're almost always going to come up as negative, but potentially could be quite alarming. And so some examples of this are, somebody who reports significant arousal when they become violent, which is very unusual, or somebody who's having command hallucinations to kill somebody, or the arresting incident having a really unusual quality. And one example, real example of that last one was a situation where the arresting incident involved the man had duct taped his partner to a chair and had assaulted his partner while they were duct taped to a chair. And that was, I had never seen that before in hundreds of police reports. And that immediately was a tag for a significant concern with this individual. So next slide.
Great. So Dr. Jackie Campbell, many of you are probably familiar with her and her research. She was a nurse in the emergency room in Maryland and was seeing a lot of women who were coming into the ER with high, almost lethal violence happening in their home. And so she started tracking that and doing more research about what are the constellation of factors that may increase a domestic violence victim's risk of being killed or almost killed by their intimate partner. And I'm going to use gendered language here because her initial research really looked at women who were killed or almost killed by their male intimate partners. She's done more work to look at same-sex lesbian relationships and is really always looking at ways to see how this applies to men who were killed or almost killed by their female partners. But when you're hearing the gendered language, that's where it's coming from. And so here are some of the lethality factors that she has found, and we'll talk about the tool that she developed in a little while. Many victim advocates are using this information to inform their decisions around safety planning, and sheltering considerations for victim survivors. And you can see here, some of them are the same as those general criminogenic risk factors, but there are some additional ones that we really want to go through in particular now in some more detail, since they're so important to not only victim safety and safety planning, but your work, those of you who are working with abusive partners, thinking about how to incorporate that information into your programming so that you can change behaviors and hopefully increase safety for that victim. So why don't we talk about some of them in more detail now, and Chris and Melissa, you can talk about your some of your experiences as well. So we can move on. Yeah. Move on to the next slide, or do you want to talk about?
Stay on, actually, I'll go back to the next. Yeah, stay on this one just for a second. Just because when we're thinking about risk as it relates to COVID-19 in particular, one that some risk factor that people don't always know, or I find that they don't know about, and in particular we should be thinking about right now, is a child. It's on the right side of this slide, but a child that is not the biological child of the defendant or respondent. So I think the important thing to know about this risk factor in particular as it relates to lethality is that it is the actual that there is a child in the home that is the non-biological child of the abuser or defendant, or perpetrator in this case. And so when we think about people being in more contact with each other, in small spaces with each other. This is one that we really need to be thinking about, at this time, is that one sort of in particular. And then the other is related to unemployment, is thinking about unemployment and about how a number of people have, I'm doing men's groups right now twice a week, and we've kind of been asking the men week after week about, their situation as it relates to COVID, what's changed, what's different. We ask about a number of these things, about employment, who they're living with. And what we've seen a significant change in particular, as we've been tracking it, is their employment. This week, we've had 2 guys who have gotten laid off of their jobs and 2 guys who got their hours cut in half. And so that's significant for them when we look at all the other risk factors tied to them. So I just wanted to mention those 2 sort of right now, and then have Chris talk about some of the others.
Sure, and just to stay on the slide just a little bit longer, we're getting more nuanced in our risk assessment as well, and unemployment's a good example of that. So it's actually even more refined than that. So there's a huge difference in becoming unemployed. Let's say that I have a job where periodically I get laid off. I'm used to that. It's easy for me to get another job in that field. Unemployment means a lot less to me. Or if I lose a job that I don't really care about in the first place, that may not mean a lot to me. On the other hand, if we're talking about my career, that I love this work, that this gives me meaning and defines who I am, and I lose that job, that's going to be a much more significant impact. And so part of this is really understanding as well, what is the impact of these things? So it's not just across the board unemployment. We're starting to realize it's actually how invested the individual is in the job that they've lost, for example.
Yeah, like we've asked Chris, we've asked the men, like, what meaning does the job have to you? Is a question we've asked the men, which gets at what you're pointing out. But thank you for that, because that's very helpful.
Okay, next slide. And yeah, let's scroll right down there. So I want to talk a little bit about stalking, and because I think, as you're going to see with the stats in the next slide, I've really come to understand that stalking behavior is really a significant concern, especially for lethality among abusive partners. And I want to differentiate between kind of, if you will, normative stalking, which is kind of a few isolated events of looking up on somebody or checking up on somebody, the kind of thing that almost anybody could do, versus really an ongoing pattern that's happening repeatedly. So what I'm describing here and what we're concerned about is not the few moments when a guy, there's a no contact order and he admits that he drove by his partner's living residence once or twice, or, somebody who made a couple calls and, late at night to see if they were doing all right. Those are moments of stalking. But what we're really concerned about are the individuals that have an ongoing pattern of stalking. I've had examples of men who have they've been given like a dozen new charges for a dozen violations of a restraining order or a no contact order. We've had guys who have been released from jail due to a violation, and they literally minutes later, they will violate the no contact order again. That's what we're talking about. And the key themes to stalking in general is it's repeated unwanted contact or monitoring or following. And the person's doing this, even though it's been made explicit to them that the target doesn't want that to happen. So it's not just about wooing somebody or what have you. And then the real key thing that's very hard to define in laws, but is really the key driver, is an obsession with the victim. And I think this is really the key driver of this, is this: I am absolutely focused and locked in on this person. They are my main focus, even if I'm not having contact with them. And of course, being on the receiving end of this, the stalking behavior causes fear. So the next slide. And again, let's scroll down there. Again, more women, as is typical, more women than men, because most stalkers are males. And so that's what we're talking about. And halfway down, half experience at least one contact per week. So when you are a victim of stalking, this is not just happening once in a blue moon. This is happening repeatedly. Also, I don't think there's a stat here. I think I left that one out. The typical length of stalking, if you're being stalked by a former or current partner, is over 2 years. So stalking goes on for a long period of time. And the last 3 points are really kind of the key things to understand the concern we have around stalking. Is we know that between a quarter and a third are going to be physically assaulted by their stalker at some point. Among those who are being stalked, women who are being stalked by an intimate partner, most of them are going to be physically assaulted at some point. And then this is the really chilling one, is that when we look at the histories of women who have been murdered by current or former partners, 3/4 of them had been stalked. And among those who have been previously physically abused, 9 out of 10. So there's hopefully this emphasizes that when we got this ongoing stalking behavior, especially coming from a romantic partner, that's a huge risk factor for lethality. Next slide. And so we're just going to move through these quickly. I think the main point I want to make about this is that I used to think back before I was trained in stalking to think of it as, somebody, you wear your dark glasses, you follow them around in your car, you're kind of like a detective or something like that. But it's much more than just that. It includes things like initiating false rumors. It includes other kinds of contact like giving gifts or dropping off cards or things of that nature. You can go on to the next slide. I think that lists some other ones of the stalking tactics. It can include things like damaging their property or vandalizing, doing vandalization, and things of that nature. Obviously, it's monitoring and tracking them. It can be remotely messing with their house systems through remote access and things of that nature. So there are all kinds of different things that involve stalking. It all involves continued unwanted contact, in part to let the other person know that I'm still aware of you. Okay, so I think you go to the next.
Excuse me, Chris, we had a question about the statistics that you discussed previously. Are those for the United States in general or for a particular state?
They're for the United States in general. So they're not international, and I think that's where, when we, especially when we start to go international, we're going to see more culturally specific variations of stalking. I think you're going to see some things like that. I think the international aspect of stalking is a sense of obsessional focus on this individual and a need to continue to have some kind of contact with them of some nature. So to me, that would be the international aspect of that. The particular ways that's going to manifest, that's when you're going to see culturally specific behaviors, whether it's within a country or with different countries or what have you.
Sure. And then we have one other question, whether it's possible, whether it's possible to provide citations, and I think we could communicate directly with this person later.
Yeah. Yes, I'd be happy to do that. I left out the slide that indicated some of the citations from the stalking, but I would be happy to do that. Again, these are all stats that come from research that's been done on stalking. Some of it actually came from the UK, so some of it's from the United States and some of it's from the UK.
Great, thank you. I will go on to the next slide now.
And one thing I just wanted to jump in and add around stalking is that particularly for folks working in the civil side of things, what TK Logan found in her research around civil protective orders is that those people who had either stalking as part of the affidavit or the allegation, the reason they were getting that civil protective order, those orders were more likely to be violated by the respondent. And in part of this is what Chris was just talking about, this relentless stalking behavior, in spite of having a civil order protection that would keep that person away from the victim.
Yeah, I don't think I need to say much more. I think I've already said most of what's on the slide. This is so much more than a few drive-bys if you're on the receiving side of this as well as on the giving side. So you can go on to the next slide. And this is just making the point I think that Rebecca just made, that those who can get stalking or protective orders, this is from the United States, I believe, the majority are going to have them violated. And in fact, about a fifth of the time, getting the restraining order actually makes things work. And what we know, and again, this is not just true for stalking, this is true for recidivism in general, is the more you monitor, the lower the recidivism rates. And so closer monitoring, more involvement, more support for the abused partner, or what have you, the better in terms of reducing recidivism. And we see this repeatedly.
So Chris, related to this one, I was thinking about in particular about the work that you and I do related to, perpetrator programming, or people call Batterers Intervention Programs, and thinking about, if we become aware of or know if this is happening, and to know, is our coordinated community response at this time during COVID able to do this, right? Are they able to do the monitoring that they were before? Is it reduced, and what does it look like? So I think it's an important part for all of us to be thinking about that do this work, to find out from probation in particular, to know what are you able to do at this time in terms of, their level of monitoring.
Yeah, and I think that there are other ways you can monitor. Speaking especially, I mean, even to the United States, but also to the international group, where these individuals may not necessarily even be on probation, is you can do some monitoring via your communities. And that's another thing that I've observed at times, is kind of the social monitoring that can happen within communities, from elders, from religious leaders, from friends and neighbors, and things of that nature. So I think that, the monitoring doesn't have to just be through a probation officer. That's most typically what we do in the United States. The whole idea is that there will continue to be eyes on this individual. That tends to have it can have a deterring effect.
Mm-hmm.
Okay, next slide, I think. So another point briefly that I'm going to make is, and again, most of this comes from the United States, and of course we have the dubious distinction of having huge levels of firearm ownership, and basically the presence of firearms significantly increases lethality. We know in the United States this is the primary driver of lethality, of domestic violence lethality, is the use of firearms. One of the things that is striking is, and I don't know if I have this exact statistic, is simply the presence of the firearm increases risk, even if the firearm itself is not used. And so I think what that's getting at is the kind of mentality that leads someone to want to have a firearm. Also, even if it's not even used, makes it more likely they may resort to using weapons and things of that nature. So I think that's it that I need to say about that slide, unless anybody else wants to add anything. So next slide.
I think while that's switching, one of the things that we're hearing and seeing is that due to COVID, there has been this increase in first-time firearms purchases, and it's too soon to see how that plays out, or hard to gather who actually is purchasing these firearms. But I do think in this heightened state of fear about what's happening with COVID and this need to kind of protect yourself, my concern is how that will play itself out in the domestic violence world, where we're also seeing an increase in the proportion of domestic related crimes versus other in cities and towns in America now due to COVID.
Yeah, and a couple more things I want to say about firearms. One is, I'm a member of, in Oregon, they have a statewide fatality review team, and I'm a member of that. And we review 2 domestic homicides a year somewhere around the state. And I've a couple of the ones we've reviewed, I believe, based on all the material that we heard for these specific cases, that basically the decision to use a firearm was made seconds before the firearm was used. And it just so happened that there was a firearm in the room in the moment that firearm was grabbed and used. That I think that in a couple of the cases that we reviewed, if there had been no firearm present in the room, it's unlikely that anybody would have been shot. Now, of course, on the other hand, there are other domestic homicides where the firearm was purchased intentionally to commit the homicide, sometimes even months ahead of time. But the point here is that all it takes is a second to kill somebody with a firearm, whereas other means of lethality can take more. And so it definitely makes a difference in terms of reducing lethality rates, not just for domestic homicide, but for other kinds such as suicide, is by limiting access to firearms, if you will.
Right.
I think this does get more. Yeah, go ahead.
Oh, I was just thinking, I think that Adams, from Emerge has done a lot of research and interviews with folks who have killed or almost killed their intimate partners. And he found the same thing, that the use of the firearm, one of the men I think he interviewed even said, if there hadn't been a gun in a home, I wouldn't have even killed my partner. Like, I wouldn't have used a knife or any other weapon. It was like the firearm was immediate, and it was in some ways more removed than using a knife or any other kind of weapon. And in those split seconds, they went for the gun. And then in hindsight, they kind of looked back over their thinking in that moment and said that, yeah, they wouldn't have committed the domestic violence homicide had the gun not been in the home.
Another thing I think, and then just to spend a little bit more, a couple more points I want to make. One is I don't think we've done the research yet, but I would strongly suspect that as we look at the reasons why people purchase firearms, we'll start to see some other distinctions. I think that people in rural settings are much more likely to have firearms for hunting and for recreation. To some extent, I think that folks in urban locations are more likely to have them for protection. And I suspect that if we could start to further parse this out, we're going to start to see some further connections between why a person has a firearm and ultimately which ones get used to commit acts of violence against a person. The point I want to make is I think one reason why some people purchase firearms is because it helps them feel more safe. Even if they never ever use the firearm, just knowing that they have one in their home helps them feel more safe. That, for example, I think is one reason why in the United States we've seen huge jumps in people purchasing firearms since COVID, because if the apocalypse comes, I'll be ready for it. I think that the second half of that is that very same presence of that firearm, even if it's never even taken out of its lockbox, that creates safety for the owner, can create a sense of danger to the abused partner. Even if there's never a threat made with it, even if it's never taken out of its place, secure location, just knowing the firearm is there can create fear, a state of fear. And this is something that I've talked with some of the men in my groups who are, own firearms, is I understand that you feel safer having it. How does your partner feel about you having that? And if they express any kind of fear, taking that seriously and considering relinquishing that or otherwise getting it out of the home.
So, Chris, one of the questions that has come in, and not in the public chat, but to us as organizers, is for us to mention a little bit more about how we should think about these as managers of Batterers Intervention Programs, and for those who are doing that work, and we know not everyone is, but so to think about this this risk factor in that way. Do you want to say a little bit about that, and then I can follow up?
Well, sure. I think that obviously one of the things we routinely ask all of our clients is, do they own any firearms? Are there any firearms in the home? Obviously, they may not always be honest about that, but we can at least inquire about that. We can also get information from our collateral contacts like probation about, is there a history of firearm possession? So I think that's one thing, and to be mindful of that, and then to talk about potential safety planning around that.
Right.
So that's what I have to say.
Yeah, and I was thinking about, in part, you'd have to have that information, available sort of previously as well. And I know that some Batterers Intervention Programs get that information and others don't. So, Laura, just so you know, it went out of the view version on the screen.
Okay, my connection seems to be working again here.
So as you're transitioning, because I'm ready for the next slide, someone was asking about coercive control. We're actually going to be zeroing in on that. So we're definitely going to be giving that some significant attention. And that's partly with this next slide. What I want to point about is that I think lethal risk, what we know is there is some connection between lethal risk and general risk, but not as strong as you would think. And in particular, what we see among individuals that end up killing their partners or ex-partners, that a fair number of them would score relatively low on most risk assessment tools. So that's a great slide. So you can get the rest of it up. They have no prior criminal history. They don't have negative peer influences. They don't have personality disorders. So, for example, a third have not previously been arrested for DV or were on probation. Okay, so I think that again, another area of research is looking more at who is most likely to perpetrate lethal violence. I think that we've got some different factors that play into that, which we'll be actually getting to a little bit later on, I think, here. So next slide. To me, as I look at, I read the news, and again, I'm part of the statewide fatality review team, so I'm often looking at the details of domestic homicides. And what I'm struck by is the vast majority of the time, there's either a pending change in the status of the relationship, or it has changed recently. And we know this, the greatest risk of the most severe violence happening is as the abused person is leaving or has left the abusive relationship. So that one really jumps out. Almost always there's been either an imminent change happening or it has happened. Also, I think loss of a job is fairly common. I see that a fair amount of the time. Related to that are other significant life changes, such as serious financial issues, or serious medical problems. And then the other one that I don't think we adequately talk about is the sense of enmeshment, really the sense of the abusive partner, as in some way their partner belongs to them. We will always be together, no matter what. That much more profound sense of they are my everything. They are my moon, they are my sun, they are my everything. There's no one else but them.
So Chris, I think this is the time to mention also that one of the things that's important for us to realize is that the risk, when we think about risk assessment during COVID-19 in particular, that the risk factors haven't changed, right, because of COVID. But what's changed is the social conditions in which we're all living in, which abusers are all living in, and victims are all living in, right? And so in part, what we have to understand is refresh our memories about what those risk factors are and about how they connect to the current social way in which people are living or the change in which they're living because of COVID-19 or the coronavirus.
Okay, so next slide. I think it was asked about stalking. A comment was made about stalking. And again, I think that really the thing that we most need to be, okay, and so here are some other things related to risk. One, again, is stalking is present in the vast majority of homicides. To me, that highlights on that obsessive quality and also sense of enmeshment. And what's even striking is that, we know that there are homicides that happen where there was no physical abuse present, okay, in case you didn't know that. What's striking is in those, even in those, the majority of the time, stalking was still happening. So even in situations where the abusive partner has no history of physical abuse, so that would be some of that coercive control, among other things that we mentioned, most of the time they're still stalking them. I also think there's often fatalistic thinking by the abusive partner, by the person who's potentially going to attempt to kill them. That's where that suicidality, which I think we're going to talk about a little bit more, is so key in being aware of. For me, as an active person working with abusive partners, that's the one that I really start to become alarmed by. So I have an abusive partner that's becoming suicidal. If they have a history of suicidality or suicide attempts, if they're getting that way, that's when I become highly, highly concerned, as in I need to take action now in terms of contacting authorities. If there's somebody providing supervision, alerting them immediately, alerting the partner or the potential target if I can. And then part of that is to what extent are they willing to consider a murder? And then again, is there a presence of firearms? So next slide. So Rebecca, I think this is back to you now.
Yep.
Yep.
Okay. Is there maybe just there we go. Okay. So again, when we're thinking about domestic violence, risk, and lethality, as I said, there's been research by Jackie Campbell, particularly on lethality, and then there's also been research on domestic violence recidivism factors. And as Chris said, sometimes those are the same and similar factors, sometimes they're very different. So we have just a slide of them up here now. This is from research of Dr. Kirk Williams, who created one of the validated domestic violence recidivism risk tools called SIR. And we'll talk in a little bit about how that is used by certain stakeholders around the country. But here we can see, right, some of it's the same. We've got the prior DV incident that, as Chris said, is one of those static risk factors. Here it's interesting that they're looking at general violence towards other family members in addition to violence towards the intimate partner. We're seeing the suicidal, homicidal, the firearms, this obsession with the victim, which includes some of those coercive controlling strategies. We've got that victim fear of reassault. Again, that's different than in the lethality one. We saw that victim fear that the person was capable of killing them. This is that the victim is fearful that she would be reassaulted. And then here we've got those attitudes that condone DV. Again, those are looking at things like, she deserved it, those types of things. And that's where Chris was saying some of that is a little bit harder to change those belief systems. And that's where you as abusive partner intervention programs play a big role in kind of unpacking those attitudes. We've got the recent separation. And then what I think is interesting about Kirk Williams's research is that he found that men who did not complete a mandated batterer program were actually more likely to recidivate. And when you think about it, it makes sense, right? Again, they're talking about court mandated programs or probation mandated, like as a condition of a criminal plea. And so I think that's interesting, right? Someone who isn't going to follow through with a court mandate, it would make sense that they would be potentially more likely to commit another domestic violence related crime. I don't know if you all have anything to add to those things, anything that pops out to you, Melissa or Chris, about the similarities or differences or things that you're seeing.
One point I would make, actually, Melissa made this, I'm swiping it from her, so credit to her, is that, firearm ownership is quite high in the United States. I think when we go into other countries, it's important to generalize it more to weapons as opposed to firearms. Because there isn't the same level of firearm ownership in a number of other countries. So that's an example where in the United States we lock in a lot on firearms because they are the majority of lethal events. But in other countries, that's not as strongly skewed that way. So I just want to note that.
Yep. Great. So next slide.
Oh, back one more, I think.
Great. So when we're talking about risk assessments, as we said at the beginning and kind of couch this whole discussion, is that, risk assessments should never be used to deny programming to someone. They should never be used to deny safety planning or safety measures for a victim. And one of the big reasons is that what Dr. Jackie Campbell found was that in her research, victims rarely overestimate their level of risk, but they often underestimate it. And that makes it it's kind of a cautionary tale for us who are doing risk assessments or lethality assessments with that victim, is that we need to make sure that we are listening to those survivors and capturing that information, but also taking into consideration other pieces of risk or lethality information that we may be getting from our community partners and stakeholders. So, risk assessments, they can give courts and advocates and probation and abusive partner programs more information, They can also be used. Jackie Campbell found that the lethality, the danger assessment that she created was a great way to have conversations with those victims around lethality and safety planning. Due to that coercive control and that isolation, many victim survivors didn't understand that they, were at that high level of risk. So it offered an opportunity for provide community-based victim advocates, or, in Jackie Campbell's context, medical providers to have those conversations and make those connections to community-based advocates. So I think it allows us to prioritize. It doesn't allow us to minimize the level of risk or deny services. So we can move on to the next slide. I think this is really crucially important for us to be thinking about when we're thinking about the context of risk assessment, how it fits into our coordinated community response. And Melissa will talk about an example from Duluth. But all of these groups listed here, and I'm sure I've left, there's many stakeholders in our coordinated community response. Many of them are using validated, which means that their research has shown that they are assessing that level of risk or lethality. Many advocates are using Dr. Jackie Campbell's danger assessment or the many variations thereof. Probation departments around the country are using a general criminogenic tool in addition to maybe an ODERA or a DVSAR, which are two of the most widely used, validated, and normed recidivism assessments. Law enforcement are often using some variation of Jackie Campbell's tool, either the DAIL or the LAP. Programs, again, abusive partner intervention programs may be in a position to either receive reports from other people, or in your comprehensive intake, you're asking some of those questions. The state of Kansas, for instance, has a really comprehensive assessment, which includes lethality and recidivism information right into their assessment. The state of Colorado has an amazing DVRNA, which they're in the process of validating. But the initial research shows that their risk assessment that they created includes lethality and recidivism factors and is used to inform the intensity of programming. Again, as we said in the prior webinar, it's not the time to go out and maybe start using risk assessment if you haven't before, but it is a good time to talk to these other community partners, see what information they're already gathering, and whether and how that can be safely and statutorily shared with you to inform some of the decisions you are making around programming right now. So I wanted to just turn it over to Melissa on the next few slides to talk about how risk information is being captured and shared in Duluth.
Right.
So if you could, I'm sorry, Melissa, but I just add one point to the previous slide.
Yep.
So the coordinated community response, if you can just go back to the previous slide for just a second. This is what I would say is this is the criminal justice coordinated community response. And that's a very important part of it. I think, though, the broader coordinated community response would include schools, it would include healthcare providers, it would include employers, it would include mental health professionals, healthcare providers, and so forth and so on. That's, I think, important to understand that we need to think, especially in the United States, everywhere really, but even more, that we've got to go beyond the criminal justice system, in part because most domestic violence is not illegal. And we'll be talking about that a little bit more here, I think, pretty quick. So that's the one point I want to make. Thanks.
Yeah, so one thing I just want to mention before I talk about this is related to a comment that Lisa had put in the chat box, which I think is important. One area I've done a lot of research on is women's use of violence, and I've done a lot of work on court-ordered with court-ordered offenders who are women women who've committed domestic violence. And the point that Lisa makes, which I think is one that we should also say, is that there is no validated risk tool related to male victims in intimate partner heterosexual relationships. So these are the ones that we're talking about. We should have sort of said this in the beginning, you know, are you need to see what they're validated for, and that these are not validated tools as it relates to male victims. So just wanted to mention that. But I just very quickly just want to mention that one of the things that happened in Duluth when I was the director there is that we were one of 3 national sites for the Blueprint for Safety project, which was a project through the Office on Violence Against Women in the US. There's a link here which we'll provide to you for that. But essentially what the point of the blueprint was to integrate sort of the best research over 30 years and practice to create sort of a blueprint for any city, county, country to implement, that if you wanted to develop sort of a criminal justice response based in the best research, what we know about best practice and risk. So that's what the blueprint was. So then if you wanted to become a blueprint site, in which Duluth was when I was there, that's what that was. So Laura, if you could go to the next slide. So just very quickly, a way in which we sort of thought about this, and risk in particular, is that we developed the Practitioner's Guide to Risk and Danger, which is kind of this piece that we created for that every practitioner should be familiar with or look for and kind of document key categories of risk and danger. They're included in a guide, and we will send that to you after. We'll send you a link to that after this call. And the one thing I want to say about, people always ask about the Duluth Police Department risk context questions in particular, and I'll show those on a preceding slide here. But very quickly, the one thing that's important to know about these questions, they are not, it's not a risk tool. They're risk questions that get at context for a very particular purpose, which is context of the incident and prior incidents for prosecutors, probation officers, and judges to understand context. So for example, a lot of risk tools, you know, will ask, has he ever previously threatened to kill you, and just have a yes or no answer to it. The prosecutors and judges and probation working on that particular case wanted to know more than just a yes or no, and wanted to know contextual information. How did that happen? Where did that happen? And so that's what these questions were really designed for. So Lori, I want to turn to the next slide. The other thing that was created prior to the blueprint but was enhanced during the blueprint was a domestic violence response team. And the point of that domestic violence response team is that they generate risk, history, and contextual data that's needed by criminal justice agencies, you know, the next day. So if somebody was arrested tonight, they're organizing all that information today, and they're organizing it in a way that's helpful to the other people in the criminal justice system in the coordinating community response. And I've worked with people in other countries, you know, just give an example is this country we were working in, they had created quite a lengthy risk tool. And what we found is that the prosecutors weren't using it, the judges weren't using it. And when we asked them why, they said, the problem is they never asked us how it should be organized in a way that's useful to us and helpful to us. So they'd collect it, but not give the information to us in a way that was helpful. So we wanted to make sure to do that. And then we also wanted to make sure that cases were processed in a way that the police could also sort of monitor the cases and be a liaison between other CCR agencies. Next slide, Laura. So these are just the example of the members of that Duluth domestic violence response team that collect all this data on risk, which we will send you the list of all the things that they collect. But I put a little asterisk by the 2 domestic violence specialists, because they're the ones who are the coordinators of all the information between all the agencies. So what happens then is they're the ones that collect all the information. So Laura, next slide. And that is what they do, is they create the divert file composition. So in that file, it includes all of these things in Duluth. It includes a summary of the risk and assessment tool sheet. It includes the ODERA score sheet, all past orders for protection, harassment restraining orders, all incidents and reports involving domestic violence. So even if the police went to a home and there wasn't an arrest, that would be in this file. criminal and civil history if the man was in the Batterers Intervention Program, and then also a bail memo sheet that's filled out. So we'll send that to you after this also. But one of the things that was also created was judges wanted to know that if this is a risk factor, okay, that's so like our judges would say, okay, so I generally know that if this shows up in a police report, that it's a problem, but how should I think about it as a judge? So what the judges did together was create sort of this bail memo sheet that helped guide them in terms of and how it would impact safety if they made certain decisions in related to that information. So that was a real key part in terms of putting all that risk information and data into practice. Next slide. And then just to share these questions, these are the risk questions for context. So the policy by Duluth PD is to ask all of these questions and document these for all incidents. So even if there isn't an arrest and on all arrests. So why this is really helpful as a Batterers Intervention Program person in particular is because if I have a guy in group right now who his living situation has changed, I have a copy of this. So one thing to know that as a Batterers Intervention Program person that, Laura, if you go back a couple slides to the divert composition, I think one after that. When you look at all that list of things, I also receive all this. I get the ODERA score, I get the past orders for protection, I get all the previous arrests, I get the criminal and civil history, and then I also get the pre-sentence investigation. So when I want to think about as a Batterers Intervention Program person, I want to look at what was the previous risk information I have. What is the living situation now? What's the employment situation now? So I want to look at all of those risk factors now and ask some questions of all the men in group to do an assessment that's tied to the current situation related to COVID. I think what's important though now is that, back to what Rebecca was saying, is that as you can see as a Batterers Intervention Program, because we get so much risk information and it's sent to us, we don't do our own risk assessment. So I'm not going to start doing them now, right? But our CCR in St. Louis County and Duluth had to work really hard to figure out how to coordinate all this information in a time of COVID. And it was not easy. I can tell you that it took a lot of just sort of finagling to figure out how to share that information at this time. But we wanted to think about sort of risk in a broader way, the ways in which it can be used and for which providers, and how it sort of can be coordinated in a CCR. So you can, I'm done, Laura, and you can go into the slide to Rebecca.
Right. So we've been talking a lot about risk, and one thing we wanted to talk about is, especially in the context of abusive partner programming, more programs around the country are looking at trauma and hope, important things to be considering when we're looking at comprehensive assessment for people who have caused harm. Especially, there is some research around the importance of assessing for trauma, since it can be both a risk, it can be all three, a risk factor, a needs factor, and a responsivity factor. And that's not to excuse their violence with their intimate partner now, but it's really to get a bigger picture of what's happening with that person, inviting them into your program as a whole person, and thinking about how to address some of those past traumas, either in your program or referring them to others. Additionally, on a more hopeful note, more programs are looking at the importance of and the science of hope and its importance to programming. And in this context, we're talking about hope as really defined as a future expectation of goal attainment. And so we're looking and working with the men in our groups as, helping them to identify goals that will maybe help them change that abusive behavior if we're looking and believing in behavior change. So really thinking to it as an outcome that's attainable, clearly articulated, and measurable. And then we're looking at way power, which is really the pathways. How can we help the men in our group create pathways or roadmaps, routes, in their mind and in their lives to meet those goals. And then the willpower or the agency, really, like how can we build the capacity for the men in our group to achieve these goals, to live, nonviolent lives in the future with future partners. And there is the Adult Hope Scale that was created by Dr. Snyder, and some abusive programs in the country, or abusive partner programs in the country, are incorporating that hope scale into its programming and measuring that hope over the continuum of the program. When we move to the next slide, I'm glad that Lisa is on this webinar today. It's interesting, the research out of Baltimore that found that men in an abusive partner intervention program there found that no hope for the future was one of the greatest contributors to IPV perpetration. And so again, thinking about and expanding the way that we are doing our comprehensive intakes with programming to include hope, could be something that you might want to consider. And then Casey Gwynn, worked together with researchers from University of Oklahoma, and they were finding, there's more than 2,000 studies really looking at that psychology of hope, and found that hope is really the single best predictor of well-being. So if one of the values that you have in your abusive intervention programming is to create well-being for the person in your program, again, you might want to just think about how hope can be an important thing to consider.
So if I could just build on that, I think a recurring theme among risk factors in terms of the person perpetrating is how much do they have to lose. Basically, the less the person has to lose, the more likely they are to act out. The more they have to lose, that's a good deterrent to them not acting out, because they could lose a lot. And I think that that's partly what this hope thing is kind of tying into. And so I think part of our work is helping our abusive partners that we're working with. What is their stake? How do they benefit from staying non-abusive or becoming non-abusive? Well, how do they benefit from, abiding by laws and not, getting into further trouble? And it's giving them reasons to have hope, to invest in that and that sort of thing. So I think this actually segues well into what we know about what increases risk or decreases risk in terms of whether it's lethal violence or just general violence or what have you.
And I think now in the COVID too, obviously it's too early to tell. I'm sure people are not measuring hope right now or have, something written about it. But I think now where traditionally marginalized and already communities that have been disenfranchised are experiencing and getting COVID at greater lengths. Many of the men in programs around the country, we've heard, already have had someone die in their family or friend circle, or have been sick with COVID. It's easy to lose hope. I watch the news and I am not very hopeful, and so I think it can impact right now men's ability to participate and engage fully in programming, and may increase some of those risk factors if they're feeling that loss of hope, like I've lost my job, my parent, people I know are sick, I have to stand in line for food. All those things can really impact their ability to think that they can achieve bigger goals in life. All right, so we can move to the next slide. I think always when I think about risk and lethality, I'm reminded of this quote from Jackie Campbell about, there is the victims and perpetrators, or one of them or both of them, had contact with either our criminal system, victims assistance, healthcare in the year prior to a homicide, and it really indicates opportunities for us to think about where this information is being captured, how we can connect those victims with community-based advocates, and really thinking about the role of APIP programs or abusive partner intervention programs as playing a huge role in, in the prevention of future homicides or homicide reduction. We can move on to the next slide. So again, just some reminders as we are moving into the last few minutes of our training here today, or workshop today. Again, reminder, all domestic violence is dangerous. So again, for the final time, I'm a broken record. Never assume that the victim isn't in danger, even if a lethality assessment scores them in at low. There are many reasons why someone may not be fully disclosing that information to you. So using the information that you do have to do that safety planning is important, or to refer to those community-based advocates. Risk is dynamic, and so we'll talk about, we might talk about the information that you get in a police report or in that informational packet may be months old by the time that person is getting into a program and you're seeing them. And so the need to constantly be evaluating what's happening with risk, especially now in the context of COVID, where things are changing every day around employment, living situations, those types of things. And really using that coordinated community response, understand how risk and lethality information is or isn't being captured in your community, and what your role is in using those risk and lethality information to inform your programming decisions.
So Rebecca, I just want to mention here that one of the things that we had thought about and stopped doing in Duluth when I was there in particular was labeling people as medium or low. And part of the reason why we did that, and I encourage people to read Evan Stark's piece, and I forget if it's, and we'll send you the link, but I forget if it's called The Dangers of Dangerous Assessments or The Risk of Risk Assessments. But essentially what he's saying in there is that, which was part of our experience in Duluth, is that when we started labeling people as medium and or low, what happened with the practitioners in the system is that they minimized their risk and really discounted them in many ways. And the thing is that there are many things on a risk assessment that won't come up, but are really causing really awful lives for a lot of women, right? So let's just take emotional abuse. I was an advocate for victims of domestic violence for 15 years. I mean, I just remember over and over victims of domestic violence telling me that the worst thing he did often was not the physical abuse or anything that would show up on a risk assessment, right? It was the name calling, it was the degrading, it was using the kids against him, getting the kids to not respect her anymore. None of that shows up on a risk assessment. So the challenge about having, in sort of the key issues that we sort of talked about here, and I think something we have to just be reminded of, is what's happening in the mind of the practitioners if you have someone sort of labeled as medium or low.
Right, and I think our next few slides talk about some of those challenges and limitations a little bit, so we can move on to the next slide.
Okay, so yeah, I want to make some points. One is that risk assessment doesn't tell us what's going to happen, when, where, to whom, except if it's DV. So it only goes so far. What research knows is that if we refine it to more of a yes-no, then kind of what are the areas of concern, how should we address these things? Another really important point, that last point, is because most risk assessments look at criminal recidivism, they're all intrinsically culturally biased, given in terms of the United States, given that we know the criminal justice system is racist and classist, that typically working class men and men of color are likely to score higher on typical recidivism risk tools, and then may be overly targeted. So we have to be very mindful of that kind of way that we're kind of replicating the racism and classism that's already there. Next slide. And then specific with DV offenders, a lot of risk assessment tools are around general criminal recidivism, especially felony recidivism. And in many states, a lot of the DV crimes are misdemeanors. And as Melissa was already pointing out, most domestic violence, the vast majority of domestic violence is not even illegal. So most abusive behavior, verbal abuse, emotional abuse, economic abuse, spiritual abuse, you can do it in front of law enforcement and they can't arrest you. And so it's really important to understand that most of the great research we have on risk assessment does not adequately address the significant majority of the domestic violence that's being perpetrated. And we don't know a lot about that kind of risk.
Chris, one thing I just want to say for our international audience, just because I know there are a number of people on here, that for a number of people on here, those some of those forms that you've talked about actually have been put into law in terms of economic abuse, psychological abuse. But I want to just sort of also say, though, what we also know is that the prosecution and convictions of those, what we've seen is extremely low, right? So even if it's been made legal in your country, we've seen almost no prosecutions, if any, or very, very few of those. So I just want to give that caveat for international listeners.
Sure. So next slide. So I think, and this just goes back to, I think that's what really important is, I think that the two, in my opinion, the two most valuable things about risk assessment, one is it indicates who should have the highest level of supervision. So in general, the higher the risk, the more closely those folks should be monitored by the larger system. And the other is identifying what risk factors that we know lead to recidivism should we be targeting in our work in part. So I think that that's where it's valuable, but it's vital to understand that just because somebody's low risk does not mean they don't need a full course of intervention around helping them become non-abusive and non-controlling. One of the distinct things about my program, Allies in Change, is we're working with almost 100 abusive partners who are voluntarily engaged in services. In other words, they are not court involved in any way. Many of those individuals would score low on any risk assessment tool you could give them, even as they're continuing to terrorize their families with their emotional abuse, their coercive control, and things of that nature. So it's and it's also relatively easy, in my experience, for abusive partners to stop their illegal abuse. Typically, just from them walking through the door, their levels of physical abuse drop significantly, even based on their partner's report. The work is really changing those belief systems and stopping the more subtle forms of emotional abuse and control that are much more prevalent, much more common, much more frequent. That's really where the heart of the work is, in my experience. Next slide.
So one thing before we get to this, there was a question that I just want to pose, and it was related to stalking, Chris. It was one that was just sent to us, which is, can you talk a little bit about cyber stalking? It says revenge pornography and proxy stalking, which is essentially when abusers use their children, as sort of instruments for stalking. Can you talk about those?
Yeah, I think those are all just other forms of stalking behavior. I know cyber stalking in particular is getting a lot of attention because that's so prevalent. And again, I think that the key thing is what we're trying to identify are these individuals who have a significant and severe obsession with that partner. In other words, they can't move on. That's really where we can, and I think the same thing with kind of the revenge porn or the unapproved distribution of sexual material or what have you. All that is, I think, all about you have caused me suffering and I want to hurt you back, and I'm going to continue to make you suffer. And I think that that's, again, where we see a significant concern about continued risk of violence, including lethal violence. So these are all just other aspects of stalking behavior. Also, I think using proxies, it's not just the children. It can be family friends. It can be mutual friends. It can be others that don't even realize that they're being used by the stalker to monitor. So I think it's a broader group that can include the children, of course, but it can go beyond the children as well.
Right. And also, this reminds me, and related to our international audience, that when we did some work in Eastern Europe and we did a focus group with victims of domestic violence there, one of the things they said is that most commonly it was other family members who, you know, his mother, his brother, his cousin, who was participating in actually the actual physical abuse of her, and also the stalking of her. The other thing I just want to mention that we haven't mentioned, that we've talked about, that we haven't talked about yet, is for our international audience, that we, Chris and I and Rebecca, want to say that you need to be careful and about taking risk assessment tools that were created based on risk data in the United States. There's some that have been made in Canada, and just using them in your country, right? They weren't intended to be used that way. Chris, do you want to say a little bit about that? And I'll just follow up about that, because I think this is an important point for our international listeners.
Yeah, what I would say is I think the core ideas behind risk assessment, I think, are international. How much does a person have to lose? What's their stake in being law-abiding? To what extent do they have negative or positive influences? So I think the general principles apply, but the specific ways it may be manifested, again, may be culturally specific. And that's where I think it's important to really identify the particular behaviors that kind of reflect those kinds of things. And they can vary from culture to culture.
Right. And then the other thing is just to think about that in some countries, I know some that are on here, is that domestic violence is not criminalized, or it's been criminalized recently. So our risk tools that rely, you know, quite significantly on criminal history, right? Those factors are not going to be helpful if you don't have criminal domestic violence, or you don't have a lot of arrests, you don't have a lot of prosecutions. So that's important. And the same with firearms. Of course, we talked about use of other weapons. And then the last piece I just want to mention is that the way in which questions are asked are important. In Duluth, we did this when we worked in some countries in Eastern Europe, for example, there was a risk tool that was being used in an Eastern European country, and there was very little response to that question, and surprised us. So we brought that risk tool to a group of battered women, and we said, can you give us some feedback about these questions and the way that they're worded? And one of the women said right away, they said, I just want you to know that with this question, if I was asked that, I would say no. And I would say no because I don't know what the word coercion means, right? Can you tell me what coercion means? And it was a question about sexual violence, essentially. But the question was worded, has your partner ever coerced you to do something sexually you didn't want to do? And I said, well, so I explained the point of it. They said, well, why can't they just ask, has your partner ever made you do something sexually you didn't want to do? And we said, absolutely, right? And so the way in which questions are also devised is really important. And so that's why we encourage people to gather groups of battered women, for example, or to give you input, particularly on that, on the way in which questions are sort of organized.
So I'm aware we're just about at time. And another point that I want to make more specific to COVID is around risk, is I think that it's, in my opinion, this is the way we're doing our groups these days, is obviously we're doing them online through video conferencing or having our group members call in. We are still offering groups, but we're having a heavy focus now to have them talk a lot about the present. We know that when people who are prone to abuse feel higher levels of stress, they're more likely to act out abusively. We know that when their partners and their children are more distressed, abusive partners will become more controlling and more abusive to deal with that. And we're seeing this with rates of domestic violence around the world increasing significantly during this time. So I think it's especially important right now to be having a lot of focus in the group work or the work being done with abusive partners on what's been going on in the past week. What are the most challenging situations you're dealing with right now, where either you are becoming abusive or you're tempted to become abusive, to identify what are the present risk factors that are present right now, what can be done to mitigate them. Some of them are having a whole lot more contact with their partners because they're sheltering in place. Others may not be having any at all, but are more tempted to potentially resort to more stalking because they can't have contact with their kids. So I think it's really, rather than talking about stuff that they did 20 years ago or things that they experienced when they were children, or doing more of that historical focus, it's really vital right now that we're talking about what's happening right now in 2020 and how are you managing all these difficult times and helping them identify ways that they can navigate this without choosing to be abusive and controlling.
Right. Great.
And I think too, connecting with your community-based victim advocates and making sure that you're having those regular or starting regular conversations to debrief with them about what your general themes that you're hearing, what are they hearing, so that you're really working in tandem to enhance victim safety right now as things are constantly moving, as people are experiencing COVID personally in their own lives or in the lives of their family and friends. I think it's important to make those connections.
Mm-hmm. So we didn't get to the risk scenario. However, I do think it's useful for all of you to use it with your staff, with your agencies as an example to look at. So we're not going to go through it now because we're at the end of our time, but just so you know, we did email you the PowerPoint ahead of time. In our follow-up email to you, we will email it to you again. So if you want to go to the contact slide there, Laura, the last one, we will send you an email after this. We will reattach the PowerPoint again, and there's another slide then with Chris's information as well, Laura. And then we will send you the PowerPoint again. We'll send you the links to all the things that we mentioned on here. Chris will send the bibliography tied to the research. We can get that to people. And then we'll just check the chat box for some other things as it relates, to this topic that we will get to. We'll also send you a survey if there's other things that you would like to hear from us in terms of future webinars. We'd like to hear from you about that as well. But feel free to contact us. We'll include our contact information in the follow-up email so that you can email any of the presenters directly. But thank you so much for your time. We will send you the recording once GoToMeeting produces that for us, so that that will be available and for your colleagues. So we've enjoyed our time with you. Thank you so much for participating with us. And thank you, Chris and Rebecca. You're just a wealth of information, and this has been so helpful.
Thank you. Take care, everybody. Thanks for all your great work.